Good afternoon. I'm your host Abdurrahim Kasho, and this is the L24 daily special coverage. The third day of voting in the referendums on joining Russia is over in Lugansk and Donetsk on Sunday, People's Republics, as well as in Zaporizhia and Kherson regions for the coming days. The referendums have been recognized as valid in the first three regions. As voter turnout has passed 50%, the voting process continues amid shelling attacks by the Ukrainian military. In the region, as Western intelligence stated, protests against Vladimir Putin's partial military mobilization order appeared to continue on Sunday in the Russian Republic of Dagestan, with videos showing police arresting demonstrators protesting against the order to draft 300,000 more Russians to army for the war effort in Ukraine. On the other hand, Ukraine's president renewed calls for Western allies to cut Russian banks from SWIFT, the global banking system that allows banks to send messages to each other, saying that if we cut Russian banks from SWIFT, we need to cut all Russian banks from SWIFT as well. To analyze all this information, I'm joined live by Mr. Dennis Speed, founding member of the Schiller Institute from New Jersey, USA, and Mr. Andrei Timoshenko, expert at the Ukrainian Institute of Politics from Kiev, Ukraine. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us in this debate. A short break, and we start our discussion. And before we delve into discussion, let me read for you this piece of information. The US has warned Russia of a catastrophic consequences if it launches a nuclear attack on Ukraine. President Joe Biden's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Sunday, speaking on ABC's This Week show, Russia's promised protection to Ukrainian regions. It might next following widely criticized referendums. Citizens in 4 regions of Ukraine were voting for a 4th day on Monday in the Russian-organized referendums that Kiev and West have branded the sham. They say the outcomes are predetermined, and even countries with close ties to Moscow, such as Serbia and Kazakhstan, say they will not recognize the results. Mr. Andrei, since you are in Ukraine, I'll be starting with you. The latest round of votes in the separatist regions scores that more than 50% residents vote to join Russia. So, to this point, Mr. Andrei, do you think that Russian forces are compelling people to participate in this vote, or simply residents over there are willing to join Russia? And do you think Russia will take these lands for good after this referendum act?
So let me start with the statement that Ukraine will never recognize this so-called pseudo-referendums, and it cannot do so. And of course, I think that a lot of pro-Ukrainian population of that regions have already fled that territories. And of course, the remaining people, they could be forced, but not only by military force, but also economic force. For example, like imagine that you live there and you need some source of income to survive, and the only option is to, find some solution by being less aggressive toward the that occupational government. So I would say that people are compelled to vote not only by military force, but also economically.
Mm-hmm. Perfectly understood. Coming to you, Mr. Speed, referendums in the Donbass, Zaporizhia and Kherson region continue amid shelling, Mr. Speed. How do you explain the Russians' actions? Does Russia has the legal right to hold this referendum, or this is another violation of international law by Putin, as the Western claims?
Well, I think the problem involved in all of the discussion at this point is that people fail to recognize that this is a war. This is no longer a set of negotiations, and that in that context, something has occurred that's changed the entire game. There's an American commentator by the name of Scott Ritter. He was with the International Atomic Energy Agency back in the days of Iraq, and he warned against the game around the weapons of mass destruction. And he made a statement just yesterday saying, if NATO doesn't back off, we are 1 second away from a nuclear war. If NATO continues to pretend that this is some game designed to weaken Russia, Russia just changed the game. They said they are not playing the game anymore. Now, the reason I bring this up is that what must be understood is the timing of the referenda. They are part of the military strategy in one sense. And importantly, they come at a time when Ukraine is facing supply problems, contrary to what is being said in the media concerning all of the great numbers of billions of dollars coming from the West and all the other things. People keep ignoring the physics of the situation. And the physics of the situation is that while Ukraine has been engaged in an offensive, that offensive has begun to scale down. They need tanks they want to get from America and Germany. The Americans and Germans don't want to do it. And in addition, nobody wants to admit that there are something between 10 and 20,000 people from NATO, at least on the ground, being coordinated by the United States and Britain. So what's going on here with respect to the referenda is that, first of all, the people in the areas are voting, as you said. The referenda are going to go the way that they are going to go, call them a sham and don't call them a sham. Perhaps by September 30th or so, Putin will recognize these as part of Russia, and then the entire strategic situation becomes one of NATO versus Russia. Ukraine at that point becomes secondary.
Mm-hmm. Very good indeed. Staying with you, Mr. Speed, Ukraine's advances last couple of weeks pose a question for the whole world. Can Kiev actually win, or this is just another strategy by the Russians?
Well, the problem involved is that you have to have extraordinary resources, and also you're talking about now the autumn rains that are coming on. What has occurred is that there was a general Ukrainian offensive in several different areas at once, something that the Pentagon and others had warned against. There was a gaining of territory. There was, in fact, that was a significant thing. But now what you're looking at is something different, which is that with the use of massive use, particularly of the tanks from Bulgaria, and from the others that gave Poland and others that gave them. Now what they want is they want more from the West. The West doesn't want to give them. They would take either putting NATO operatives in to help to train people for that purpose. They don't want to do that. But the problem involved is no longer a question of what they want to do. The fact that the problem involved is that now you've got the call up of the 300,000 reserves. Something that the Russian army has done many, many times, actually, in the sense of knowing how to do it. I don't mean that number necessarily, but that's where we are. And we are about to see something happen that, in fact, frankly, the people in NATO and the West were not prepared for. That's why they're saying things like, we don't recognize the referenda, we think Putin is bluffing, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Very good indeed. Mr. Andrei, coming to you, as a Ukrainian, do you really think Ukraine still have a chance to push back the Russians, especially after this referendum voting and acts?
I want to bring up some history because for many centuries, Ukraine was a part of Poland. Like 300 years ago, Ukraine was a part of Poland. And if you look into history, there were a phenomenon in history that was called the three divides of Poland. So 300 years ago, Russia, Germany, and Austria divided Poland slice by slice 3 times. And so there were like 3 divides of Poland, and there was a distance in 20 years between the first and second divide. So the reason why I'm bringing this up right now is that I'm disappointed to draw some parallels with the modern day.
Mm-hmm. Quite understood. So Ukraine will always fight for its territory. Now, let's tackle another topic. During the UN General Assembly speech, the Russian head of diplomacy, Sergei Lavrov, has criticized Western nations for what he called a grotesque fear of Russia, telling the United Nations that such states were seeking to destroy his nation.
When Russia's turn arrived at the UN General Assembly, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian top diplomat, took the stage to hit back at pressure on Moscow led by Washington, which he says is trying to turn the entire world into its own backyard.
The official Russophobia in the West has reached an unprecedented grotesque scale. They do not hesitate to declare their intention to inflict military defeat on our country, but also to destroy and fracture Russia.
On the same day, referendums continued in 4 regions in Ukraine for people there to express their will to be annexed to Russia or not. Referendums condemned by Western leaders and dismissed as sham. However, Moscow calls them a sort of way of expressing the will of the residents in the 4 oblasts. But while fighting is still raging, the head of the Russian diplomacy said the regions would be under Russia's full protection if they are annexed by Moscow.
The entire territory of the Russian Federation, which is enshrined and could be further enshrined in the Constitution of the Russian Federation, and unquestionably is under the full protection of the state. This is absolutely natural, and all of the laws, doctrines, concepts and strategies of the Russian Federation apply to all of its territory.
The comments came after an explicit warning on Thursday by the Russian former president Dmitry Medvedev that any weapons in Moscow's arsenal, including strategic nuclear weapons, could be used to defend territories incorporated into Russia.
Mr. Speed, some analysts claim that the Russian military mobilization is not made for the Ukrainian cause, but rather to strengthen the army presence in the face of the 3,000 Western troops, in other words, NATO troops gathered in Eastern Europe near the Russian borders. What are you saying about this?
Well, first of all, there are approximately 20,000 troops altogether in terms of special forces, contract agents, and others that are involved on the ground in Ukraine. Some of them are commuting back and forth across the borders, and a lot of them are basically there. And they are part of what forms the Wagner, the units that exist, not I'm sorry, not the Wagner unit, but the other units, the special forces units, partially fronted by the Azov battalion, which has been reinforced by these NATO contract personnel. And what has happened is that, as you just played with Foreign Minister Lavrov, what he had to say is that we are now in a circumstance where Russia will redefine the circumstance of the incorporation of the 4 territories as part of its territory. Therefore, an attack on the area constitutes an existential threat to Russia. The thing that's ironic about this, let's all remember that it was in 1991 that the West occupied Russia, in effect, after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. I mean, that is to say, financially speaking, and from the standpoint of trade, from the standpoint of the monetary circumstance and access, the United States was all over the place. Now look at where you are and ask the question, how did that happen? Russia was looted, and many things happened in that period. We're talking about also a state that disintegrated and now has been reorganized from about 1999 until now, which must have learned some lessons from that. And one of the lessons is that having seen Boris Johnson negate the negotiations that by March 29th had reached the point that there were actual discussions about Ukraine being neutral, no weapons of mass destruction, no foreign bases in Ukraine. These were all things that were in play at that point, and they were stopped by Boris Johnson and by NATO. And so it's known by the Russians that this happened, and therefore the Russians would prefer to begin to fight the people publicly that they've been fighting privately. And that, I think, is fundamentally what we're looking at here.
Perfectly understood. Very good to hear these points. Coming to you, Mr. Andrew, European countries since the beginning of this war, they have been holding monthly meetings with no vision ahead for a better solution. They were only focused on how to aid Ukraine with weapons only. But why they don't want Zelensky to have a peaceful talk to end this crisis, as Mr. Speed on March of this 2022? Why they keep escalating the war?
Actually, Europe is much more, careful in supporting Ukraine when we compare Europe and the United States of America. Like the United States of America, United Kingdom are more assertive in supporting Ukraine militarily by, politically. In Europe, on the other hand, is more, stagnant in this regard. So, for example, there was an election in Italy yesterday, and there's a suspicion that there would be some more opposition to the support of Ukraine from Italy, for example. So I would not be that, assured that the Europe will stay strong in supporting Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Perfectly understood. Mr. Speed, recently you have said that you were in Europe. I want to talk to you. So, what do you think the situation in Europe right now? Will Europe, the EU, will stay united after this conflict reach an end?
Well, I think it's interesting. I was in France and Germany primarily. I spoke to people there, various people who were activists from different political persuasions. The essential thing that when you're talking to people in Europe, it's good to be there, by the way, and just experience the degree of both fear, panic, anxiety, frustration, and rage that people have for many different reasons. And that whether they support Ukraine or they may also support Russia, or their view is that it has to end, the conflict has to end. One of the things that you have in Europe is that it's now beginning to get colder. And as they say, General Winter is one of the other elements in the Russian arsenal. Now, the Russians did not cut off the oil. What happened was that Nord Stream 2 was cut, and now then Nord Stream 1, of course, this was during the period of the war. Now that no longer supplies fuel. And so what has now happened is that people are really beginning to feel it. Demonstrations are beginning to happen. Some of them are about fuel and some of them are about the war, but often they combine. Sometimes people are talking about a matter on energy and then it becomes a matter of the war. It combines. And it's left, it's right, it's center. And it's all over the place as I understand it. But the two places I experienced were France and Germany, where it was particularly acute.
Mm-hmm. Perfectly understood. Now let's tackle another point since you talk about Germany. The President of the United Arab Emirates, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, has signed an agreement with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz that covers accelerating energy security and industrial growth. Abu Dhabi National Oil Company signed the agreement to supply liquefied natural gas to Germany to face the energy crisis.
It's good that progress is being made here and that there are signs that our country is now able to supply itself with gas. But it is also important to see that at the same time, there are perspectives for the longer-term future, where we are concerned with operating in CO2 neutral way and advancing hydrogen projects.
Mr. Andre, if this war, so-called special military operation, goes on for a longer period than it already has taken, will this energy crisis that crippled Europe's economy spread to other sectors and other fields, such as health and education? And what about Ukraine? How they are facing this economy problem?
I know that already some European companies starting to flee to the United States, searching for lower natural gas prices. So at some point, I would say that the US economy even benefits from the decisions of European governments, to stop the supply of Russian natural gas. And so at some point, the US economy benefits from the choices of European governments.
Mm-hmm. Don't you think that U.S. has got the benefits from this war better than any? I mean, they put a stone over two birds, saying that they crippled the EU economy, that is a competitor to the U.S. one, as well as they strike the Russian army, which is also a competitor. So do you think and do you agree that U.S. is the most beneficial from this war?
we should also consider the U.S. military-industrial complex that also, benefits because it's, direct benefit from supplying arms to Ukraine. So, yeah, I would agree with you. Yeah.
Quite understood. Coming to you, Mr. Speed, the whole European countries are looking now for an alternative to the Russian gas. Italy, at the very beginning, already secured its status in this matter by signing a new agreement with Algeria. But what about the rest of Europe? Why Germany was so late to secure an agreement for its energy matter?
That's a very good question. The reason for all of this is that they lost their financial nuclear war. What happened was that during the period of the beginning of the conflict, during March, the French finance minister, Bruno de Le Maire, stated, we are fighting a financial nuclear war with Russia. They had this big confidence that they were going to somehow devastate the Russian economy and the ruble was going to fall to, ridiculous levels of value. In fact, the opposite occurred. That's why they made no preparations, because they believed that their transatlantic financial schemes, especially looking at what they believed to be a devastated, relatively small Russian economy, that they would win. They miscalculated, in particular, the strength of the relationship between Russia and China and certain things in that regard, but they were arrogant. They thought that they could, in fact, bring the Russian economy to its knees. It didn't happen. They didn't have a second backup move. There's one other thing about Germany, though, to say. Germany has a peculiar problem because of their economics minister and their foreign minister, who are both greenies, as they call them, who believe and are opposed to CO2, they say, but yet now we have far more a reopening of the gas plants, the oil plants. And what's happening is that the people in Africa and Asia are looking at this and saying, look at these hypocrites. They just said a year ago, everybody's got to reduce emissions. Then as soon as they get in trouble, they automatically begin to reproduce them. So what has happened is it shows a lack of any preparation, a wild, delusional approach, and they are now paying for it in ways in which they were completely unprepared fundamentally.
Mm-hmm. Very good indeed. Mr. Speed, since you are in USA, I have read an article that says Joe Biden, by his aid in Ukraine, by money, by weapons, he's the one that's responsible about the inflation in USA. And even Democrats in his group, they are taking him back. I mean, they are not taking him for another presidency term. Do you think Biden is kind of responsible for the situation over there?
I don't really know that Biden is responsible for anything. I mean, he's responsible fundamentally. He has to be held accountable. That's a different issue. I don't think Biden personally wants to go to a nuclear war with Russia. I think he said that. I think he means that. But what you're referring to is the following. It's been since 2008 in particular that the financial West has been unraveling at an accelerating rate. But instead of the problem being dealt with back in 2008, there was a bailout process which made the banks even larger than they were before. The banks have grown by about 75%, the top 6 banks of the United States in particular. So what has happened is that the inflation at some point was going to appear in the economy. One of the things that was convenient was to then claim that this was occurring because of the war, whereas actually the war is occurring because of the inflation. Now, I don't mean that that's why Putin invaded. I mean that that's why Washington wanted, or let me put it this way, London and Washington, under conditions of such a war, believe that they can divert their populations from recognizing that their financial system has imploded. And this is the great secret of what is actually unraveling in this world circumstance. That's also what impels them to go to war with the Russians. They don't really want to go to a military war. They want a financial subjugation. And neither Russia nor China will accept this.
Mm-hmm. Very good indeed. Coming to you, Mr. Andriy, there is a saying and there is a word that Ukraine has been sacrificed for an already agenda has made. Because when you see the money has been given to Ukraine, weapons, it seems that everything was prepared. Do you believe that Ukraine was used to attack the Russian growth?
So if everybody knew that Russia was a threat for Ukraine, so why NATO didn't include Ukraine beforehand as a NATO member, so to prevent the Russian invasion. So I think, yeah, your question makes sense. That I think that if NATO really didn't want Ukraine to get hurt by Russia, it would have been a NATO member long before the Russian invasion. So your question makes sense.
Question number two. Let us say that this war reaches an end. Do you think that Ukraine will keep thinking to join this bloc, NATO bloc?
Well, officially, yes, because it's stated in the constitution of Ukraine that Ukraine pursues the joining NATO and the European Union. So politically, yes, of course. At least at the level of political statements of top authorities, of course, Ukraine will still continue, trying to join NATO and the European Union.
Perfectly understood. Now let's tackle the last point. The Russian mobilization is sparking a new protests on Sundays across the nation. Over 100 people were reportedly obstructing a highway in Dagestan, which is one of Russia's less developed regions in the North Caucasus. Local police reportedly fired warning shots into the air in an effort to disperse the protests, according to Russian media.
We are not scared. It's fine. If a draft order arrives, we will go. If it doesn't, we won't.
You know what I want to say to Britain? Stop giving Ukraine lethal weapons. Stop.
Mr. Andrei, do you think this protest in Russia will cause a loss of faith and trust in Putin's operation in Ukraine by his people?
The mobilization is always a stress for ordinary people, and I can understand them most of the time. That there is an interesting fact that this is the third mobilization in Russia ever. So the first mobilization was in 1914, before or during the start of World War I. Then the second mobilization was in 1941, when the Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and it's a third mobilization that takes place in 2022. So this is even an outstanding event from the historical perspective.
Perfect. Mr. Speed, what are you saying about this? What is your interpretation for this mobilization and the protests in Russia?
Your other guest made a very important point just now, and that's very important to think about, because we're in a circumstance in which Russia believes this to be an existential crisis, or is at least invoking the cultural memory of same for the purpose of doing this mobilization. However, now let's look at the actual political military question. You have a Ukrainian offensive which is beginning to lose steam. People in the West no longer want to support it in the same way in various of the countries, particularly in Europe. There's a penalty being paid now personally by various Europeans that they don't want to pay any longer. And the issue is, there's on the other side, now you begin to get a mobilization of Russian forces. As Scott Ritter pointed out, he said, well, if the Russians really need to, they can go 25 million people deep if they really need to do that. So, they can go as big as the West wants to go if you want to keep the conflict from becoming nuclear. But here's the problem. Everyone is calculating, as they did in August of 1914 or July, August of 1914. But at a certain point, nobody really knows how this is all going to play out. And if you get a circumstance in which, for example, various rogue elements, which do exist, were to be deployed, particularly by NATO, then you have a circumstance where this becomes a truly, truly incalculable circumstance. So to answer to the question, this is seen or is going to be certainly portrayed as an existential matter for Russia. And I just want to say concerning Ukraine itself, I think this is tragic. I think that the country was used. I think that they even were trying to reach a negotiated settlement and that the Anglosphere interfered. I think that's why Boris Johnson was personally on the ground so many times. I think that Joe Biden personally would wish to do something, but has, shall we say, little cognitive flexibility on these matters, and that we may be seeing a circumstance more dangerous than the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis because there's no back channel to Russia actually operating the way that John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy operated with Nikita Khrushchev against their respective militaries.
Very good indeed, and we have reached the limit of our show today. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. Mr. Dennis Speed from USA, thank you Eva for taking part with us, as well as Mr. Andrei from Ukraine. Always, thank you so much for participation with us. And for this, say bye-bye and take care of yourself.